And so in some sense, it's just that you have someone working in painting versus someone working in literature, which of course, literature in any language always needs to be translated in order to reach a wider audience. But I also want to mention that nearly every Yiddish writer who ever lived was also fluent in at least one other language. And these were all people who could easily have chosen, if they wished, to be Russian writers, or to be German writers, or to be English writers. So being a Yiddish writer, instead of being a German writer or a Russian writer or an English writer, was in fact a conscious choice to devote oneself to a particular audience. And in the case of these Soviet Yiddish writers, this was a choice that they paid for with their lives. And in effect, they were betrayed. And I say this in a very literal way. I don't mean just because their audience died and then no one was reading their work. I mean this in a very literal way. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union made a decision to sponsor Yiddish culture. And what I mean by that is that they were paying for Yiddish schools, Yiddish presses, Yiddish magazines, Yiddish literary critics. There were Yiddish literary critics who were salaried by the Soviet government. I mean, can you imagine this in any country in the world in any language? And the Soviet government started inviting back Yiddish writers like Der Nisser, who had traveled to Western Europe and other places that appeared to be more hospitable to them. So these writers were welcomed back to the Soviet Union with great fanfare in the 1930s. Then, in 1948, Stalin turned around and said that these writers were in fact part of a Zionist conspiracy to bring down the Soviet state, and he executed them. And I think what you see here is a betrayal, which is unfortunately very familiar to Yiddish literature. And it's that sense of betrayal that I wanted to bring into the book, not only through the historical stories in the book, but through the personal stories in the book. So many of the things that I incorporated into this novel are stories that have to do with trust, whether it's a sort of a historical trust of a community that thinks that it's living with friendly neighbors who turn out not to be friendly, or even a betrayal of trust on a more personal level in a romantic relationship. And I think that what this betrayal of trust really shows is that the many myths that we believe about the way art is transmitted from generation to generation. And what I think it really shows is that, as I said before, what lasts is not necessarily what's best, and that what's lost does not necessarily deserve to be lost. I think that one thing I want to mention about the real-life art heist in New York City that inspired this book is that it took the museum almost an entire day to notice that this Chagall painting was missing, which maybe reveals something about the security problems at this particular museum. But the stories that were written by Chagall's friends and by many other writers in Yiddish literature have been missing for over 50 years without anyone noticing. In my novel, as you know, those forgotten works of literature are also stolen. They're plagiarized and published under an American writer's name, since she realizes that no one will ever notice if she steals all of her work from Yiddish literature, since no one's ever read it. And in fact, she's quite successful at this and manages to promote these works as her own. And the paintings thief and the plagiarist are very intimately linked. To solve the mystery of one theft, you also have to solve the mystery of the other. And ultimately, the thief has to make an impossible choice about what in this world is really worth saving. That question of what's worth saving is what determines what paintings hang in a museum, and I think it also determines so much of the literature we read. And as a person who's in a position to sort of bring these works to a new audience, I want to tell you about some of these stories and also about the language in which they were written. Yiddish, I think, is a very misunderstood phenomenon. So just to explain sort of the basics of what this is, Yiddish is the 1,000-year-old language of Eastern European Jews. It's often said that it's a dialect. People often ask me, is Yiddish a dialect of German? And my answer is only if you think that English is a dialect of German, or Dutch is a dialect of German, or Flemish is a dialect of German. The Yiddish linguist Max Weinreich used to say that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And that's something that Yiddish unfortunately never had the benefit of having. But I will tell you that it is a language. It is written in Hebrew characters. Like English, it evolved out of medieval German. Unlike English, it has about 15% of its words are from Semitic roots, from Hebrew and from Aramaic, another ancient Jewish language, which people probably best know as the language that Jesus spoke. And another 15% of its words are from languages of Slavic origin. So what we're talking about here is a European language and a European literature. But what's unique about it, I feel, is the way that even its most secular writers draw on ancient religious sources, from the Hebrew Bible and from many other sources building on it, to create a modern literature that is always asking questions about the edges of human understanding of the world. There's a problem of awareness of this culture and this literature in America today. And the best way I can describe the situation that we have in America today in terms of this literature is like this. Imagine it's 500 years in the future, and no one speaks English anymore. Maybe there are a couple scholars here and there who have made this their little pet cause, and just read it in the library or something. But most people have no awareness of English, and no awareness of all of the literature. There's only one work of English literature that has even remotely survived in the popular imagination, and that work is Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Okay, not a bad pick. If you're going to save one thing from all of English literature, maybe I would have picked Hamlet, but not bad. Unfortunately, the way that people are aware of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is not having read it in the original, and also not even having read it in translation, but rather they're aware of Romeo and Juliet through a wildly popular movie adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. And one of the adaptations of this movie is that at the end of the movie, Romeo and Juliet get married. This is pretty much the situation that we're in with Yiddish literature in America today. There's probably only one work of Yiddish literature that anyone in America has any awareness of, and that is Shalom Aleicham's Tevye the Dairyman stories. But people are not aware of these stories from having read them, or even having read them in translation. Rather, they're aware of them from the Broadway musical and the movie Fiddler on the Roof, which I know was part of your performances for A Novel Idea. I probably don't have to say very much about the differences between Shalom Aleichem, the Yiddish writer's original stories about Tevye the Dairyman, and the stories that appear, and the way the stories are presented in Fiddler on the Roof. I'll say a couple things. For one thing, Tevye doesn't live in a shtetl. Kind of a big difference. But one thing I will say is that those of you who have seen the play or the movie may remember that the sort of pivotal point in the movie, in the tension in the family, is when Chava, Tevye's third daughter, marries a non-Jewish man, and this sort of tears the family apart. And at the end of the play, you sort of see how she and her husband go in a separate direction from the family, and you sort of see the tension and the difficulty of this reconciliation as she decides, in fact, to make her own life with this non-Jewish husband. I probably don't have to say much more about the difference between this ending and the ending of Shalom Aleicham's novel about Tevye the Dairyman, except to say that at the end of the original Yiddish version, Chava is abandoned by her non-Jewish husband and returns to her family. And I think what's interesting is what that change reveals about what was necessary in terms of making this story accessible to a modern American audience, and especially to an American Jewish audience that was increasingly assimilated and incorporated into American culture, and the way to make this story acceptable to such an audience of both Jewish and non-Jewish theatergoers. And I think it reveals a lot. I just want to give a few examples of the Yiddish stories that I translated and incorporated into the novel, because I think that it will show you some of the ways in which I tried to incorporate these resonances of an awareness of a world beyond our own, which is a religious resonance that appears frequently in Yiddish literature. I thought to myself, the only thing that people probably think about if they're thinking about what Jewish literature of the past was about is they figure that, if it's Yiddish literature, it must be about a goat in a shtetl. And so what I decided was to make the first story that I incorporated into the book from Yiddish literature to be a story that actually takes place in a New York City apartment building, which is actually a much more popular setting for Yiddish literature than the goat in the shtetl, believe it or not. And the first story I included was a story by the Yiddish humorist Moshe Nadir, an American Yiddish writer. And this is a story called The Man Who Slept Through the End of the World. The story is about a man who we might call a narcoleptic. He's always falling asleep. Falls asleep at work, falls asleep on the way to work, on the way home from work, at work, falls asleep at parties, falls asleep at concerts, can't keep his eyes open. It's just sort of the way he is. And one night he's asleep in his bed, his absolute favorite place to be, of course. And in the middle of the night he hears a loud rumbling sound that wakes him up. And he thinks when he wakes up that maybe he should go out and investigate the source of this sound. But then he thought, well, that would require getting out of bed. Not so appealing. So he goes back to sleep. The next morning he wakes up, and the first thing he notices is that his wife is gone. This is upsetting to him, but not nearly as upsetting as the second thing he notices, which is that his bed is gone. Then he is even further upset when he looks around the room and he sees that the room is gone. Tries to look out the window, sees that the window is gone, outside is gone, tries to run down the stairs and yell for help. There's no stairs down which to run, no air in which to yell. He quickly realizes that he slept through the end of the world. Now, I'm not sure what your response would be if you found yourself in this particular situation, but it would probably be a little bit different from our hero's response, which is, now that I've slept through the end of the world, how am I going to make a living? Especially now that eggs are $1.25 a dozen, and who even knows if they're fresh. So this is his first concern. His second concern, which perhaps is more familiar to us, is, now that I've slept through the end of the world, where am I going to get a cup of coffee? I always start my day with a cup of coffee. So eventually the gravity of the situation starts to weigh on him a bit more, and then he gets a little bit more resigned to it. He says, well, the world's end is over, what can you do? I might as well go to the movies and kill some time. Of course, unfortunately, the movie theater, along with the rest of the world, has also disappeared. He then thinks to himself, my wife isn't the type to disappear. Some people's wives might do that. She never really struck me as that kind of person. He starts thinking to himself, I wonder if she disappeared with the guy from the top floor. He then quickly investigates and discovers that, in fact, along with his wife, the guy from the top floor has, in fact, disappeared, along with the money in his pants pocket. So the gravity of the situation now begins to weigh on him more and more, and then, as the story puts it, he begins to bang his head against the void. But as the story concludes, it was a very soft void. And so he didn't hurt himself, and he was able to tell this story. So that's the end of the story of the man who slept through the end of the world. Second story I want to mention that I incorporated into the novel, and these were all, if those of you who read the book know that these are stories that I adapted and translated and really put into the book as sort of part of the plot. So the second story I want to mention is a story by Yud Lamed Peretz. Peretz was a giant of late 19th century Yiddish literature, and there's a story he wrote called The Dead Town. It's about a traveler who picks up a hitchhiker on the road. And he picks up this hitchhiker and he asks him where he's from. And the hitchhiker says, I'm from the Dead Town. Traveler says, I never heard of that place. Can you show it to me on the map? And the hitchhiker says, oh, no, it's not on any maps. And the traveler says, can you explain this to me? Why is your town not on the map? And then he says, well, let me tell you something about the town where I'm from. And he says, this town was built in a place where it was illegal to build a town. And now that's the way I translated it when I was adapting this story for an American readership, but in fact, those who were reading the story in the original Yiddish at the time of Peretz would have known that what that meant was that town was built in a place where it was illegal for Jews to live in Poland. So he says that this town was built in a place where it was illegal to have a town, so to speak. But despite the fact that it was illegal, people started moving in. All the Jewish institutions of community institutions grew up there. Schools were built, synagogues were built, everything that the community expected developed. The town started prospering. There were lots of businesses that moved in. But as things go, there was a sort of a boom and a bust. And eventually, the town took a decline. May this never happen to Bend. The businesses started losing money. And eventually, it became so bad that they started foreclosing on homes. And eventually, all the public property in the town had to be sold. And foreclosure auctions were going well until they had to sell off the cemetery, at which point the dead people got very, very upset, started coming up out of their graves and going home. So now, as the hitchhiker tells the traveler, most of the people in the town are dead. There's still some living people there, but the dead people really have the upper hand because, they don't have to worry about making a living. They kind of have an advantage. And so that's why it's called the Dead Town.